have to be dialed into, but yes, you're
Okay.
on part of it.
But yeah, that goes back to why we said if we did 2 1 million gallon towers in Corcoran, that would get you to that 6 million gallon. So yeah, that's that 3-to-1 ratio, so.
Okay.
Okay. I'll just add one point. When these development phase, I'm sure, but these are the uses, so this is when they come in. These aren't guaranteed. that
Right.
they're built
Absolutely.
Operational. So when we say 2025, just so we're not saying this thing's fully built out. It's not a guarantee that every unit is at that, right? It's just when it's in the phasing plan, so.
Yeah, it would be a worst case scenario. Yeah. Thank you.
The 2035, 2040, is that just put at the last because you expect development to leapfrog that?
I can answer that. That's straight out of our 2040 plan, and there's some assumptions even 3 years ago that we do differently, but specifically the yellow was the policy, and I think it's still the current policy, is that we're not really requiring existing neighborhoods to hook up. So because we couldn't carve them out, or at least have the opportunity for them to come in if there was an issue with septics or whatever, or wells. So really the intent there was policy driven, that we're intentionally not really expecting them to hook up.
Yeah,
We're
so
pushing.
it may be beyond that.
Yes, potentially, but if you look, that's, 0.4, that's the small, because
Right.
they're not as dense.
Right.
They really are a small contributor to the overall.
Okay, well, yeah, we'll come back to this, but, we'll keep moving on. There's more questions, so. So yeah, just to talk through, we'll talk through each one of the design elements, and kind of what I want to do on this slide is just, track our scope. What things have changed from when we originally, started this project in the fall? What are the differences and what's contributing to differences in cost and scope? So, well, number one, we haven't had any scope changes with that. That actually got posted for bid today. So that's all on track and has MDH approval, and nothing is expected to change with that. The trunk infrastructure, there's a change with that element when we're talking about the raw water to well 2, and that's kind of an addition because they're constructing, or identifying the Bellwether Park as the location for well number 2. We're doing that test well, which should mobilize at the beginning of next week. And so there's some piping associated with that, and it just makes sense to construct that at the same time. So that's kind of tallied in as an extra when we're talking about our overall cost estimates. And again, this goes back to even, when we did an overall project summary back in June. And so that's kind of a reference point. And so maybe I should have said that at the beginning, but that's kind of our reference point. What's changed from that point as we're looking and moving forward. So water treatment plant, we're talking about the capacity increase. We're talking about the long-term planning and what it means to build this infrastructure and invest in this site. We've taken some steps with how we laid out the site to provide a lot of ability to build on, and then also too, if softening becomes a requirement in the future, that can be accomplished. So this is kind of, there's a lot of investment, I think, going into this site and a lot of opportunity. So that's factored into kind of how we're laying out this facility. And then two with 2 versus 3 filter cells, we're talking about a gravity plant and those opportunities for additional growth. And then also too, as it's still an open item, is the architectural finishes. So we'll get into that, and that's not something we need to decide today. But I think later on in the presentation, when we go through the model, it'll give you an idea of our canvas that we have to work with. So, then lastly, the water tower. Obviously, we're changing the anticipated location. So there is costs associated with the land acquisition and also the water main to get down to that location. Some considerations if we want to go 750 versus 1 million, and then also 2 further considerations for whether we want to pursue a composite or pedestal style tower. And again, that change relative to cost comes down to the price of steel and how much steel is involved with each type. So And then at the end, you know, I just highlight market volatility, cost escalation. We all know what inflation's doing, and those are things that, you know, we weren't quite anticipating to this degree, you know, in June of last year. So we keep those things in mind and try to, you know, give you a real sense of what could be expected. Our idea is not to sell you into something that's way under budget and say, yeah, we want to fit into this budget. What do you want? What is the investment? You know, what's going to set you up the best long term, and give you the best idea all in, so you can plan appropriately and make decisions well informed. All right, you can skip to the next. So if there's any questions specifically on this, you know, this cost correlates to our engineer's estimate, our engineering fees, and then also just some contingency. So all in, you know, we would expect this element of the of the project to round out to that value. One item to note is that value includes the well pump, which will actually bid under the water treatment plant project. That's the idea. So hopefully you get some good bids here coming in. And there is some cost escalation associated with steel casings for these wells, but that has been factored into our estimate, and that's what we're going with at this point. So, any questions on the well? That thing is going in, so we'll know soon enough. We're projecting bid opening on the 31st, so we'll know in due time where those come in.
So we're looking at 11-12% cost of inflation?
What's that?
11 to 12% cost of inflation between the 350 and the 395?
Yeah, okay, and that's another piece to maybe look at. We're talking about the construction estimate.
Mm-hmm.
This line item
Yep.
is corresponding to this, so
Right.
it's not this.
Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So there's some inflation associated
Yeah, quite a bit.
due
10,
to the steel cost. So.
12%.
Mhm.
And keep in mind that this is a snapshot at pre-design. We still got 6 months to go to when we'd actually bid out. I mean, the well is getting bid out now, but the larger project, the tower, all those, I mean, we're still 6 months, 9 months, and potentially in the future to be bidding that out. So, I mean, realistically, we're not expecting it to go down, but we don't know how much it's going to go up too, you know, to be quite clear. So we're trying to reset it based on data, and we'll continue to reset it on data as we have reasons to believe. It's quite the exercise to go through these cost estimates. I mean, they're not bread and butter stuff. They're specialized pumps, they're specialized vendors, and the team can speak to that. But I mean, it's an extensive process to do this cost estimate, so, you know, so we can't do it every month. So we're trying to do it where we feel appropriate at decision points.
Yeah.
And so also too with the well drillers are extremely busy, and so I think that's also pushing costs up. Everybody is very busy, and even to, I know a couple outfits that have had difficulty getting new rigs and new equipment that they're waiting on or have them waiting on, so that's probably a pinch, I think, isn't it? We can go on to the next one. All right, so then the trunk infrastructure, the additional raw water main, well number 2, that's estimated at $200,000 additional. But there is some advantage to including that now, as I said, with the other trunk infrastructure that's going in. And then for this cost estimate, we did shift some of the site utilities into the water treatment plant cost estimate, so there's a bit of a, just shuffling scope as we understand what would be bid out under various packages. So that's still tracking well overall, and some of it has to do with that shift between elements. Are there any questions related to the utilities aspect of this? I think Steve will lament on the price per foot of some of the trunk infrastructure going in, and so it's a bit of an unknown, so, but I don't know if anything else it has to.
No. So this is just to extend it from where it's at Bellwether to our water treatment facility, so those would be the construction costs for that.
Gotcha.
All right, and then we can dig in here with the water treatment plant.
Can we recoup some of that cost with development, or probably not, because Bellwether's already plotted now?
So we have, yeah, so with Bellwether, they're bringing it to the development boundary. So we bring it as far as we can with our policy. They're required to bring it to their property boundary. So they've just come in with the 8th edition, which will actually truly bring it to that very western boundary. So, yeah, they'll bring it there. We have a crediting program, so we credit them for some oversizing. But then we get it a little bit better. But yeah, and then we have to take it through their property boundary.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, so then digging into the water treatment plant cost, this is the largest piece of, largest element that's escalated as we're looking at increasing the treatment capacity. Originally, as we talked about, we were talking about a 1.4 MGD facility. That construction estimate was at 5.5 million. And as we're talking about the 2.3 versus the 2.5, we have those broken out. And again, I tried to follow kind of a similar format to that original estimate as we're breaking these things down, so you have an idea all in what the investment is. And, you know, kind of as we've talked about, there's kind of this consideration between the 2-cell, how far does that get you? And then 2 with the 3-cell, this includes just that third basin, right? It's not gonna say that the third basin is running on day 1. This does not include the equipment to put into that third cell, because there's no use in doing that now. So we tried to be economical when it came to breaking out these costs and differentiating between, 2.3, what's gonna get you going, what's gonna give you the most redundancy, and as we talked about, kind of that build-out phasing, what makes sense is, do you wanna do 1 addition, or do you wanna do 2 additions in the future? How long is your runway? What opportunities might you have if a larger user came in? And so that 3-cell option includes that third basin. It includes all the associated storage for, clear well and backwash water, as well as the detention time up front that's needed. And so both of these designs offer enough detention time for this facility as it grows. And so I think those elements are baked into this cost, and it's not an overly designed facility. It's not a bunch of extra bells and whistles, but it's something that you can invest in, and it's going to get you through to this ultimate 6 MGD build out. So that's what I would emphasize kind of with this breakdown. Also, when we're talking about architectural finishes, we kind of, as we've talked about these ideas, what I would say is kind of our base case would be something like a precast tip-up wall panel. And, hearing the feedback that you all had when it came to, something that's durable materials, something that's timeless, something that's sturdy, we factored in what I'll call kind of the base plus when it comes to, brick, something that you can have a little bit more creativity with the architecture without adding a lot of cost. And then, if we're going to talk about kind of a premier, that's some of those examples that maybe included a lot of the metal and glass and the flashier elements. So what these costs include is what I'm calling kind of the base plus, and getting your feedback of saying, yeah, we want to have something that's sturdy, something that's timeless, something that's going to be, easy to maintain and add on to in the future. So, are there any specific questions when it comes into these? I mean, I know these are bigger numbers than what had previously been presented, but these are the things we've stepped through to this point. and listening and getting your feedback, looking at capacity and,
My only question would be, why did we look at 1.4 back a year ago? And now we're talking 2.3, I mean, what was the rationale of looking at a number that low?
yeah, well, maybe defer your see if more back there.
If I remember right, it's mostly the box. At that time, it was bellwether.
Oh, okay.
And just as we moved along here, this pace is picking up more. So now from the colors, you can see we're beyond the box.
Yeah.
And the style of the clear wells and concrete and things like that, so.
Okay.
It really is just a matter of the past couple of years of what we're seeing as demand.
All right, thank you.
Ash, could you please speak to how much of the increase is due to just the scale of the facility going up versus construction costs being higher now than a year ago?
So the scale of the facility,
The 1.4 versus the 2.3?
sure, yeah, and some of that gets to what we talked about with the filter cell sizing, and as we're looking at the ultimate build-out, so that's what we want to do, we want to say, what is going to be the ultimate demand, and how can we work back in a way that makes it so you don't have a facility with way more extra pumps, extra piping, things like that, and so we're talking about the filter size, we said 20 by 20 is going to get you into this phase where you see 5 cells at the ultimate, and that's kind of a comfortable place to be, instead of, 8 really small cells. So I think, there's some costs associated with kind of that decision. And then I think too, just a lot of the cost has to do with, that corresponds to larger, clear wells, right? We talked about incorporating more storage, at the, water treatment plant itself, because that kind of gives you some redundancy, relative to the tower, that kind of be more operational flexibility. But a big piece of this is the, cost of materials. That's just kind of an undeniable fact, and we don't want to be the people who guess low, right? Because that doesn't do anybody any favors,
Mhm.
when it comes to that, so. And I can let Ryan speak, when it comes to, Ryan really worked on a lot of the treatment plant costs.
I would say that there's a core cost to the facility, which is captured in the initial estimate. Like Ash said, we have a detention tank, we have a base clear well, we have a base backwash tank to hold the water. The majority of the cost increase would be in that nominal increase in capacity, going from 1.4 to 2.3. Then we pile on top of that a percentage for this, what we assume to be maybe a 3 or 4% inflation has become greater than that, so then we pile that on top. But the majority of the cost difference is that price per gallon of treated water. So a 1.4 facility is this size and footprint. We bump that out to 2.3, add a 65% to it. It has a proportional impact on the price.
Thank you.
And yeah, I think too, though, when you're looking at also the 2 versus the 3 cell, there is some economy of scale when we're talking about that. I think that's maybe an important piece to tease out too, is, 2.3 to 3.5. There's a lot that goes in on the front end when it comes to design, when it comes to mobilization, when it comes to bidding. Some might see it as a good deal to get a 3rd cell for an extra $1 million on the whole, so. Those might be some things to pull out of this.
Cost per gallon is a lot lower, yeah.
Right, yeah. So we can skip to the next slide. And then lastly, the water tower, we're factoring in these various costs. The construction costs here presented are based on more recent quotes. And, the price that we had back in June, that too was based on a quote. And so there just has been a lot of price escalation in there. And this is something that we're able to better capture just based on vendor quotes, because it's one element, right? It's not a water treatment plant with a lot of variability and things like that. So, kind of, when I pulled through on the summary, I only considered some of these composite tower options, just because that seems to be, you know, if you want to spend your money on these various elements, that might be a piece that you consider the composite with a strong advantage over the pedestal, given the other factors that weigh in, so. And then two, there's that element associated with the alternative location. That's a piece that includes both the land acquisition and the additional infrastructure to get down to that location.
How much of that is infrastructure versus land cost?
Well, we didn't want to specifically break that out because
Yeah.
that's open to some level of interpretation, but
A lot of it, when we're talking about the truck infrastructure, we're seeing that. And then you talk about cost escalation. I can just give examples of when we did the 2020 water main project along County Road 116, we're seeing water main of that size double what we did, you know, just 2 years ago for similar type projects. So from a scale of, yeah, these are going up pretty significantly. Valves are up 60% over what we paid last year. Hydrants, where we have steel components, just a lot of that stuff we're seeing. In the water utility infrastructure, some pretty significant jumps here just in the last year or so. But yeah, we don't want to say.
Yeah, I get that.
But the vast majority of it is in the infrastructure.
It's a tough number to swallow.
To get it there, so.
Can I ask a question? That alternate location, if we were to go back to the original Bellwether site and such, we would save $825,000? I mean, that's just the alternate location costs guesstimate right now,
Yes.
right?
Yes, you'd say that. It's not that, someday that water main has to go in, but for an upfront cost, yes, we have the water main in place.
Then again, in my mind, is if we do an alternate location, the original location is still available to us for a second well, which, in my mind, I've got my hands around a ground tower.
I mean, a second tank.
Yeah,
second tower, yeah, or storage.
a tank and stuff, yeah. I just, nope, I don't want to, don't confuse me anymore. I'm good. Thanks.
Well, so I understand that includes land acquisition and piping water from the tower, from the treatment facility to the tower. But even when we went back to the original site, we had to pump water from the treatment facility to that tower. So is that factored in the number?
This is the pipe, so that pipe's already in place, so when we talk about.
So
that-
so
that
this
1.
is just purely moving it to the other spot?
That 1.4 number from that previous infrastructure, that's the pipe from our treatment plant to the east to Bellwether. So then that would be in place, and that needs to go regardless, just to connect the two systems. This is, you're right, to go from the treatment plant west to that other location. Keep in mind, we're crossing under a county road, we've got to dig through, we've got to go through the other road, the other roadway through there, so there's just some complications there as well. I mean, but the vast majority is just the cost of everything and fittings and what it takes.
And you're saying we would have to incur that anyway, just later as different parts of the city develop?
It needs to be incurred, you know, if it happens with development, they put it in, we credit it back, and so it's not as simple as I can tell you it's it's an exact percentage. There is a cost from not capturing those credits, but they're not capturing those full funds, so. But it'll go in at some point, and then through that crediting, there's a portion of funds that the city doesn't capture at that point, if that makes sense.
Maybe how I would simplify it, if I may, Mayor, is that 825 is day one when the plant's starting. We basically move that tower from alternate site to Bellwether. It basically, roughly in this best available data, reduces the project cost $825,000. When development or something, or a future need west of 116 is triggered, either it's installed through development through some form of credit system, or it's a separate project that we initiate. But if you're trying to compare apples to apples on just where we put that tower, it's a baseline difference of 825. Now, to give you, this is a precursor to what we're gonna bring back at the next council meeting. How does that impact the system, right? It's a big number, how does it impact the system? Then there's kind of two components. There's area charges, trunk area charges, and then there's the user rate. So typically capital costs are put into the, there's a plan, you put those into the area charges. This would be a capital cost. It would go into the area charges, get spread out, and theoretically collected as development came in. If development doesn't come in fast enough, whatever that debt service is, then has to get applied back down to the user. So it's a bunch of more just simulations, sensitivity analysis that we're working with Northland on at the next meeting. But that's generally how it would apply. Theoretically, first it would apply to the area charge, and then if that didn't meet the projections or something happened, then it would then go back into the users, and it would depend on how many users we have. It would be a policy decision on how we manage that. So that's kind of how it impacts, or how it's financially paid for at a high level.
So we would anticipate then, whatever the system design that we choose, that really impacts future TLAC fees most directly.
Yes, we would intend to collect that in TLAC fees. If we didn't get that, it would get passed on to the user. If the world caved in and it was too significant of a burden, then we've always wanted to keep this a user-based system.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it would be Armageddon to not do that, and that's the sensitivity analysis, but we want to make sure we have a plan. That's the elephant in the room. We got to make sure we have a plan to meet these projections, and the council needs to understand those risk tolerances. So last time we checked, we still had a viable plan that was presented at 6 months ago at a work
Presented
session.
it in August at the work session, and at that point, we had a $14 million number within the plan. So we're looking at how the cost increases that we're seeing, how that would all play in. And like Kevin said, ideally, we could capture it over TLAC fees, and we can always change TLAC fees, so it'll be really important for us as staff to continue to monitor how we're doing on that overall growth, and make sure that we're thinking through that as things come in.
To Dean's question about the alternative site versus the original site, if we put a tower on the alternative site, would we ever put a tower or a storage tank on the original site in the future? Would that be in the wrong spot?
Would that systematically be in the wrong spot, or?
I mean, no, you could have a tower at both of those locations, or storage at both of those locations. The thing you'd want to avoid is having like the tower right next to your treatment plant.
Right, but I mean, his point was we'd still have the other site, but I'm wondering, would that site actually be a viable site because you already have a tower feeding that area? Would you be looking for a site outside of that area for a next tower?
Probably for the next tower, yeah.
Ideally.
Towns don't usually have like groups of water towers. They have
Well,
like one
it's like-
here, one here, one here.
I'm thinking of is you have a water tower here servicing this area. Why
Yeah.
would you put another water
That's what
tower
I'm saying.
to service that area?
Same pressure, so just how much volume you have.
Right. Ideally, you'd have one tower for each pressure zone. You may recall, if you've driven through Champlin, how they had two towers really close to one another off 169. I believe one of them was decommissioned, but so ideally, you'd have one place to control your hydraulics versus two. You could split your stored volume into two locations, but the most efficient approach would be to have one larger tower to control the head conditions.
But as we're talking about, we're gonna end up having two towers in
Different
these
areas.
at some point.
Yeah, in different areas, that's what I'm saying, because if you had the one in the alternative location, if you put another one in the original location, you're
Yeah.
tied to a certain distance in the area that you cover versus your second tower could be further out.
Well, yeah, I mean, with everything is controlled on the same pressure zone, right? So you're gonna set your tower height, so everything in that pressure zone can be serviced based on that height. And so you set your tower heights so that it can service the entire pressure zone. So wherever the source comes from is less important than the fact that you have the 12 on volume, because they're all the same. So, but that's something that we could run like a hydraulic model on and confirm that that would work. You know, or if there's a more advantageous spot, we could look at that.
We listened to the neighborhood, and we're close to having an alternative site. The thing that I don't want to give up is that capacity or that storage. And when it was talked about a ground storage tank would be advantageous after the initial first or second tower. So I don't want to lose that storage site instead of calling it another tower. Does that make sense? And my background is from the neighboring community. I mean, Maple Grove has the 2 underground storage towers, underground storage tanks and stuff. I want to make sure we don't lose that, because right now it's $825,000 that we would not have to spend for extra water capacity, not the element of pressure. Am I saying it right?
One thing to note with that Maple Grove example is that those 2 underground reservoirs are directly connected and adjacent to the water plant where the pumps are.
Right.
And so if we put a ground storage reservoir off at the park site or a different site, we would need to bring that water hydraulically back to the pumps, or else put pumps out there at that site.
Right, I understand that.
Yeah, there'd be that difference, whereas Maple Grove put the tanks, the ground storage tanks next to the pumps at the water plant, which might be an option here still with the site we have with a little land. We could increase ground storage at that location.
And one of the underground tanks is on an elevated hill. I mean, there is some natural pressure already there right now so, yeah, okay.
Yeah. And as we talked about with the park site, that's never gonna be like a fully buried type tank, you know, we
Right.
talked about.
I think it was like 40 foot tall.
And if you mount it or something like that, then you can.
I just don't want to lose sight of that
Sure.
asset that we have for water.
Yeah, and like, if we go back to thinking about the pink and yellow map, that first tower will get you through those pink
Yeah.
phases of development, so.
Mayor, may I also just throw out there that as we build these plans, as we learn our system, we're better positioned. I mean, we've done a lot of analysis up there. We're better positioned to capitalize on a specific site. As development comes in, we can work with them on, hey, we got to carve out this. So, there's going to, or I guess I'm getting, there's going to be other opportunities to look
Yep.
for other sites. We're not just stuck going back to Bellwether.
Right.
It's a place that we could go to, but, there's going to be other opportunities to acquire, find spots that may even be better suited
Yeah.
than going back to Bellwether.
No, I understand that. Thank you. I want to get to that 3D rendering. How are we doing?
I appreciate the discussion.
How are we doing on time?
I think, I would like to get into that too. I know we understand the financial plan is very important, and we can continue this discussion at the next meeting. If you have any thoughts afterwards, email Jessica, and we can try to do our best to incorporate that.
Yeah, we want to make sure to get your feedback if there's specific things we should be looking at. One of the questions I had for Tammy is, are you seeing other places not moving forward based on the current environment? And at this moment, they're not seeing anyone not move forward with plans that they've had in place to move forward. But we'll continue to monitor that, and we're looking at bringing forth that, a portion of that 5-year financial plan related specifically to utilities.
Is there any sense that any of these suppliers or manufacturers of the equipment, the pumps and the water mains and so on, are they seeing their capacity increase over the next year or two? Is there any chance that this could come back down based on what we already know?
It's really hard to say. For instance, I'm working on another project that's in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and it's design build, and they're not, for that project specifically, they're not factoring in some drop, but
I work with pipe in the ground more often, and I'd say no, there's no light at the end of the tunnel. We're hearing from suppliers, PVC or their suppliers actually kind of being told the opposite of rationing allocations of pipe material. They can only see out so far, but unfortunately, we're not hearing that this is a short-term condition.
I think a best case scenario would be some sort of flattening or plateau, and that's, you know, crossing your fingers.
Okay. Good to know. Thank you. That helps with our decision.
Go to the next slide. And so then, this is just a roll-up of those numbers, and kind of what I put in there is the base option. And again, I think another thing to emphasize, both of these options are good options. They're both gonna set you up. You know, it's just a matter of, you know, the base, and then what we see, I call the growth. It could be a totally different name. That's something you're like, yeah, is this the right terminology? But that's just what I meant with is saying, you know, the 2-cell, 750,000 gallon composite tower, that's gonna set you up for your, you know, your new water system. And also too, if you feel that there is, you know, reward to additional investment in going for that growth model to say, you know, we might wanna construct that 3rd cell to have it on hand and available, and then, you know, put our chips on the table and do that 1 million gallon tower, so that in the future we can construct one other 1 million gallon tower and have that redundancy in the system. You know, because otherwise, maybe in the future you'd have, you know, 3 storage facilities if they were smaller, or you know, if you did a 2-cell, you might have 2 phases of addition versus if you did a 3-cell, most certainly only ever have to build onto it one more time. And so those are just some of the pros and the cons to consider for these options. So I just want to kind of explain those terms I chose arbitrarily. And again, the water tower costs associated with that are both composite numbers.
Ash, would it be safe to say that one column is hedging your bet towards conservatism, one bet towards growth? And so if you hedge towards the growth, that's the way you feel that the community is going to go, is set your tack towards a faster pace of growth, then you tend to have a better chance to yield some return on that economy of scale side of things. If you hedge towards the more base or risk averse, then you risk not being able to get that benefit of economy of scale. You're going to take more increments and have more expansions with more soft costs associated with each step.
So we have to figure out how much this inflation will slow the economy and slow down housing, basically.
And everything else.
Yeah, we'd have to be world-class economists who are wrong half the time.
Or psychics.
You don't have an
Yeah.
equation in your
Don't
phone
have
for that?
No.
And we're sharing in that challenge. We're the microprocessors trying to take
Yeah.
in these inputs and give you some options on outputs that help you at least navigate the path, pick your path.
But none of these costs include chips. It's all,
Maybe potato
Those are
chips.
bad.
yeah.
Not yet.
No, I'm serious, because there's a shortage of some things that are more acute in nature rather than systemic. So like, certain factories and certain technologies were shut down for almost the entirety of COVID. And that stuff is just coming on, but steel wasn't one of them. So the steel is not a acute situation, it's more systemic inflation of a commodity. And that's, I think, that's what the question was, like, that. It's not a shortage, it's sort of an economic.
Demand surge.
Yeah.
One
Well,
of
there's a
the,
shortage of delivery.
Well, it's a shortage in not an acute shortage based on a definable situation like the chip shortage and COVID
Yeah,
and
no.
transportation. That is an
Transportation is-
acute short-term shortage, whereas steel is more of a global demand production issue.
And the infrastructure law that just got passed for $1.x trillion, that is probably
Oh,
creating a lot of
Everyone's
additional
doing it.
construction.
yeah.
It'll probably mostly go to waste, though.
That is one silver lining of this particular infrastructure project, is we're building it out of concrete, steel. We do have control, which would be impacted from the electronics and some of those pieces, but a lot of what we're doing here is your core material, metals, and concrete, being a concrete gravity plant, we're harnessing gravity. Those things do play to your benefit with this particular project.
I like the idea of economies of scale more than I like the idea of growth. If we're looking at labels, but.
And then, yeah, so these are, again, are just, more comparison charts. That you can, you know, read back through the numbers. I don't know that we have to spend a lot of time on other things, but again, base, option, and the growth option. All right. And then this is just a plug of what Kevin's already talked to you about and what he'll present further. Oh, sorry, we have this one more thing for the 3D model. This talks a little bit about the chlorine gas versus hypochlorite cost comparison. We had some numbers in our previous presentation that we wanted to update based on the specific demand for this facility. And so at that 2.3 MGD sizing, this kind of just breaks down the chemical cost, cost per day and annual cost, to have a comparison between just, again, pure costs associated with the chemicals. There's CapEx expenses for the system themselves, and so that is there just for your information. When we're talking about the 2.3 versus the 3.5 facilities, we would anticipate both of those facilities being able to get by with the smaller chlorine storage tanks. So I know before when we presented this, we talked about it, you know, at a larger scale, what you might ultimately end up with if you did chlorine gas with the 1-ton cylinders. And there's some concern over safety and different measures and things associated with that type of system. But with this initial build, there's a reasonable opportunity to go with the smaller cylinder gas tanks, chlorine gas tanks. And so that might alleviate some of the concerns around safety, and given the savings with respect to chemical costs, that might be something for you and also due for Public Works to consider as we get into more detailed design. So.
Which of the two has a more robust supply chain in terms of long-term availability in spite of shocks?
Yeah, I would say they're, given your proximity to the Twin Cities and supplies, I would say that they're more equally. I don't think there's a drastic difference between the two. There's a lot of facilities that rely on chlorine gas, and if everybody was unable to get it, everybody would be in a lot of trouble.
Are we able to
I
produce?
would say that hypochlorite, just when it comes to the cost of it, I think that has more opportunity to potentially increase because there is maybe less demand, there's less facilities using that type of hypochlorite versus chlorine gas is a bit more broadly used with municipalities, and that might offer some.
But hypochlorite is something we can make, you said?
What's that?
Hypochlorite is something we could produce ourselves?
That is also another opportunity, yes.
Or
But
Do we-
we still
do-
rely on raw materials to generate it.
do either of these products have alternative uses that we could have a security issue with? That we have to worry about someone coming in for theft? You know what I mean?
I don't think there's a market for either of these, or there'd be a desire for someone to go in and grab it.
Not your copper pipes.
Well, nobody would think they'd be crawling under
Catalytic
catalytic converters and
Yeah,
stuff
right.
too, right?
Yeah,
True.
yeah.
So,
Good point. I guess I haven't heard that.
May I ask a question aloud to the council?
Sure.
Just to interrupt for a second. Is a 42% increase in the cost of this system alarming to anybody where we would actually contemplate not doing it and holding off on, like when we sit and think about the inflation and everything right now, and we just had 7.7 released, I think, yesterday. And the economic reality of the United States right now, and the humongous unknowns, and we're relying on a growing housing market to pay for this thing. And we're not economists, but is there any thought to, we have this unknown variable, and we've seen what can happen in a housing shortage, and we're extending the finances of the city and counting on this unknown variable, how strapped, is that a conversation that,
I think we should have that conversation after we get the sensitivity analysis, absolutely.
and that's coming from Tammy is gonna set the
Yeah.
table for,
Yeah, at the
Tammy's
next
pulling
meeting.
all of that together for us based on what has come in, what we had in the financial management plan had everything that had come in so far for plats, but we have seen 7th, 8th, and 9th of bellwether, so we have some additional, we just need to do some tweaks based on what has actually come in for platting.
Yeah, we provide some of the assumptions and stuff that go into that. We work with her on that, and we can go through those assumptions that we're making, with the report in detail or to the extent you guys would like.
all right, that's, sorry to hijack.
I think it's.
But yeah, I think,
Can I ask the
I think it's a
question?
good conversation
40
to have
per-
once we know that.
You came up with a 42% increase in cost related to,
6 million, it was 14, it went up 6 million.
it was 14, but that was based off of 1.4 million gallons per day.
It was it was the big one.
So what's the real increase if we go back to that 1.4 million gallons a day and stop going down to 2.3 and the 3.5? I mean, that would be their bare minimum.
It's not gonna be that
size,
different.
right?
It's not gonna be that different. The numbers are the
I think that's
same.
something that we
Percentage.
could have you guys just summarize, and there's a lot of numbers that go into this. I'd rather give you a fair number and a number off the top of the head, but we can kind of roughly break that down and include in the packet if that's.
But you're right, you're getting 65% more water treatment capacity by going from 1.4 to 2.3.
Right.
You're buying that. And what you're doing is you're prepaying for that,
Okay.
which is a risk, but it's a fairly, if you look at the path of what's happening today, you make your own judgment on how much the risk that is, of course, but you are getting value for that, and that value, if you buy more today, the cost per gallon would be less overall.
Okay.
I was just gonna add quickly that I think it would be easier to retrofit into using hypochlorite. Say there was a shortage, there were
This is the
shortages of
next
chlorine
question
gas
I was
in
gonna
other
ask.
parts of the country. We aren't one of those, at least for the last pandemic episode, but if we have gas systems in place, it's easier to retro into using liquid chemical.
Okay.
In fact, so if there was a the community of Hastings didn't use chlorine at all. And when they had a breach, they had a failure in one of their tests, bacteria tests, they took out the fluoride system and just put in chlorine bleach to feed with the pumps that they're using for fluoride. They just swapped it out temporarily until they could get a permanent system. But I think that's one slight advantage to the gas system. Once you get in place, you have more leeway to revert to liquid versus if you had liquid to revert to get that gas system in place would be much more intensive.
All right. And we can move on to the next slide. Da-da-da, drum rolls. So these are our 3D renderings of the water treatment plant. And I think we could just go right into the 3D model. I'll try to drive that here. And what you can do for now is ignore some of the colors associated with this building. It's not gonna have a yellow roof. But when it comes to the renderings,
Oh, sorry.
oh, there it is. Okay.
There it is. Yep.
Oh, it's okay.
It could have a yellow roof.
It could have a yellow roof if you'd like.
Could you get a weather vane on top in the rendering?
Right?
Yeah, so
Cupolas.
again, as we're talking about this is the west side. This area would be the office for the operator. These buildings would house the chemical storage.
Is that a garage door though?
This is a garage door, if you wanted to put, store like a generator on a trailer or something like that. That was a request from Public Works folks, is having some utility.
Is that where they would offload chemical then too?
Yeah, so the chemical
Okay.
trucks, as we talked about, there's like an entrance coming in off of this side, and then the driveway wraps around. So they would stop here and get the chemical through these exterior doors.
Sure.
Yep. And so this is the detention tank. The aerators will sit in the building on this upper level, and then the detention tank volume is kind of through here. Your water main is gonna come in to this basement section and this basement section. And as we kind of scroll around, we have on this side our, sorry, I'm not doing that job. There's our electrical room in this corner. All of your high service pumps would sit here, and your finished water would come off of this east side of the building. And then this is the side that would, get built onto. And so you could imagine kind of a similar geometry of this half of the building kind of just getting mirrored down. So I think, one thing to notice is there's a lot of underground storage. So when we're talking about this facility, a big piece of it is this backwash tank, your clear well tanks, and then this is where high service pump sits. So this is all clear well volume. And these things, again, as we build onto the facility, that extends to the north, both above ground and below ground, so.
Imagine that is 2 cells.
Yeah,
And to get to 6 MGD, we would need 5.
so that would,
So it would be
Bring it out.
2/5 of what it would be. But that core facility that we were talking about earlier, that detention tank aeration area, that's built into the initial construction, what you're seeing here, that's sized to accommodate the 6 MGD potential. Also, the office, we're only gonna have 1 office, we won't need to add that part with each expansion. The electrical room would stay the same. So those core elements are, you're paying for that in this first project. But then as we expand out, we have it planned so that we can stay in those lanes and add cells with associated clear wall and backwash storage.
So even the storage room doesn't expand? Just the,
Storage room wouldn't expand, but we would expand the chemical space, chemical storage.
Yeah,
where it's in
okay.
motion, yeah.
yeah,
And-
chemical
and-
storage, that's what
yeah,
I
and
was
so
referring
your,
to.
the space for your chemical storage wouldn't necessarily need to increase proportionally to the volume. You're gonna have more storage, so there could be opportunity within the future footprint for other, storage spaces or public work,
Right.
workshop
Or we wouldn't-
type.
We wouldn't have to build space once we have enough. We wouldn't necessarily have to build a structure above that backwash tank if we had all the storage that we needed. But the thought is that that allows you some leeway if you did ever want to switch the type of chemical you're using, or let's say you wanted to invest in manufacturing your own sodium hypochlorite. Whatever it might be, you have some freedom to change at the time over the course of the next 4 years.
So this is kind of walk us into the facility. We can kind of, oops, whoa.
It's hard to do.
Gotta calibrate this mouse here, sorry.
Hmm.
So this kind of lets us walk into the facility. Ooh, that scroll bar is sensitive. Yeah.
It's a narrow doorway.
Yeah.
You don't do a lot of video games, do you?
I went back with our CAD designer. I'm like, yeah, I stopped with Super Nintendo. Call of Duty and all that stuff is not something I've done. So
I was
this,
struggling with this too.
yeah, so this gets us into the facility. I wonder if I can get up here. This is where we would, oh, yeah, this is embarrassing. Sorry.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, so we're gonna get out of this rule. There we go. I'll stick with the sections here. Trying to get flashy for you guys.
So this is the level of, like, I think you call it base plus exterior finish? That's what this would kind of look like?
Yeah, so again, this is considering like a brick veneer or brick, type of construction instead of like a tip-up precast panel.
Mhm.
There's a lot of variation, and we talked about this with planning and what they would like to see. They thought there was some really good kind of architectural relief when it came to the various levels, and, there's the pitched roof. We talked about having this tall, wall right here, and kind of how do we break that up, and there's some opportunity with the bricks and kind of doing some banding or some other way to kind of cut that.
I think you should make it out of old gray corrugated steel and make it look like an old elevator from
There you go.
sitting out in the farm area. Tie it in that way to
Yeah.
our rural community.
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of opportunity, but, I think at some point, somebody wanted to see a barn, and so
Mhm.
People just
It's,
drop the grain off there by
it's
accident.
kind of
There's some elements of
harkens
that.
to that.
Yeah.
But also
It's an
too,
opportunity, yeah.
yeah, you can make it whatever you want. Like, to me, these awnings look a little, contemporary, but you can make them whatever you want. And so there'll be a lot of time as we get
Mhm.
down the line, and, to put that touch on there. I think the main thing is that this building is designed to fit the process, right? We talked about the waterfall, so this building height can't really change because that's the top of the waterfall. We can't go deeper with these tanks because there's a water table down here that we have to contend with.
Mhm.
And I think we're doing a lot with the square footage that we're providing here. There isn't a lot of wasted space, and one of the pieces that we ended up doing to get more clear well volume is bringing those filter cells higher. So the filter cells live kind of at this elevation. And so that allows us to fit more within, more efficiently within that envelope, so.
Right, it allows us to kind of harness that space below the filters as storage for finished treated water versus letting it go unexcavated. It allows us to fill that gap, see the thirds there?
This
You're
area.
highlighting, yeah. By moving the filters up, we're able to really just build that into a tank. We had 2 walls already constructed by virtue of the 2 adjacent tanks. So by just putting a floor underneath them, we harness all that storage and really maximize the footprint.
So,
Very good. I like
The
it.
other thing I would say is with brick being the kind of the core plus, price or base plus, we did, from our architect, you could interchange different types of stone veneer that you see on a lot of homes, so you could mix and match. I think some of the council had different images that they found online where you could mix and match that, so it wouldn't have to be brick, it could probably interchange with stone. But as you get into the more marble and more of those larger stone that I think were in some of the examples, there was a fire station water plant combo in Victoria that uses a higher, we would say that would be the premium, where you start with a large stone or marble type pieces like that.
So, yeah, I think, there's also, and I can't recall if I put this in the thing, but there is kind of a figure that shows the eventual build out. And so, as we get down the line and we talk about finishes, we can say, oh, what would this look like for the initial build out? And then, what opportunities would we have to maybe break up the colors or do different things as it expands.
It Kind of reminds me of an old factory with those large windows on top.
Those could be, what we have in mind there, it's called, they're these translucent wall panels, so they aren't windows, it's just, it lets light in. And they have that grid work, but those could be louvers, so it could look more like more hidden with slats. We could put an Aircraft kind of a
I think they look
glass.
nice, you know, I think it breaks it up.
very soft.
I like it.
Yeah.
Could be different, like you said, even the metal, the corrugated metal, found a couple examples since our last session where there's some architecture pieces that we could show you. But this does offer, with all the different blocks and pieces and elevations, it offers a lot of opportunity to kind of mix things up.
Yeah, it reminded me of like of an old grain
Mhm.
elevator that you drive by in the middle of nowhere out in North or South Dakota, you know.
Or even some of the buildings in Duluth, with some of these pieces, you could imagine.
Yeah.
Looking like those warehouses and things.
An open canvas.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes. So,
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
You talked about softened water. We've had that conversation in the past and stuff. How many communities, what communities, if you know, actually manufacture softened water off of these things?
I think off the top.
And then how soft? Is it the same as a softener in your home?
yeah.
Not quite as soft as a softener in a
Okay.
home. I think there's Minneapolis, St. Paul, there's Richfield,
Okay,
Eden Prairie.
so there are large communities doing that.
Usually the larger communities, and they've made those investments early on. But those I mentioned, that might be about it for this metro area. So,
I just, in my mind, where I'm at right now, you want to water your yard with unsoftened water, and you obviously want your home to have soft water, so that, take it down to the landowner's decision on that instead of the city providing soft water
yep.
to the homes and stuff. I don't want all of a sudden start killing grass or start killing yards and stuff because we're delivering soft water to them, so.
I don't know that it's that soft that it actually harms grass though, right? Because all these cities, these people are watering their lawns.
Yeah, that's true, is that a cost we need to incur? But I just had to ask the
driver for
question.
softening would be regulation on chlorides on the wastewater side. So if regulation gets established on the wastewater side of things, it's really difficult to take chlorides out of the water after the fact in the wastewater end. The preferred route would be to eliminate them on the drinking water side, on the source side, and gain the benefit of not having those chlorides throughout the whole system. Essentially, you have to put a membrane on the treated water. We'd be better off putting a membrane on the drinking water side and having less contaminants in the water throughout.
Got it.
Then treat it really good to drinking water quality on the end, on the wastewater.
Thanks.
All right. Anything else?
So when are we looking at decisions? What's our time frame?
Next meeting in terms of the financial stuff.
Yes, so next meeting, we're looking at the financial piece, and then once we
There's
get
a
some
time.
feedback from you all on that, I think that's probably the next decision.
Yeah, that's the next critical one. I mean, it's gonna be relatively fast unless you guys elect to pause or reevaluate or whatever that ends up being. But I think, you know, even in the next couple of months, we'd like to finalize these decisions. And then we would move into final design. You know, so, you know, that, you know, I'd say end of second quarter, we'd like to, if assuming we're going forward, then we'd like to advance the final design and try to get this built, maybe, or bid out, maybe what, the end of fourth quarter this year?
Well, yeah, at the end of the presentation, there's kind of a schedule ahead, and some of those things can flex, and you can kind of see overall where we fall, but the last slide has kind of a block schedule. So this kind of breaks out each element and the design timeframe associated. So if there are decisions that can be made and we can say, yep, we want to do a tube cell and this, and that's something that we're advancing at this point until we're told that there's a pause, I guess. So the tube cell is kind of what we're working off of at this point. So.
Good presentation.
Thank you. Thank you,
Question
guys.
for Kevin. Do we know, based on what we've seen so far, are TLAC fees where we need them to be? I know we've talked about updating at least the southeast side. Is northeast appropriate currently?
We had always planned to, once we actually finalize this, to update it. So they were updated 3 years ago when we first initiated this. So there was a big adjustment when we actually started evaluating this. Obviously, there's another adjustment over what we've seen here in the last 2 years that's warranted. So, part of that deal is gonna be like, we might, even at the next meeting or two, we might say, let's update these based on available data right
We
now.
probably should.
And that will be a combination of that and south, so we can do that when we feel that it's warranted and justifiable and there's a change in plan, and this definitely meets that, requirement in my opinion. So that is
Are we?
definitely part of it.
Is it appropriate to consider anticipated inflation over longer time periods? I know for Southeast, we're saying, 10, 15, 20 years down the road, but things that we collect now, is it appropriate to consider the future cost that's actually likely based on that timeline?
There's some things there I guess we can better speak to that and address it at the next meeting, if that's okay.
Sounds great.
Yeah, there's some things that we want to stay in line with, but we'll make sure we understand all that and do the due diligence we need to present you a number that we believe.
And maybe it makes sense in light of that, maybe we should be acquiring land now and getting some of the costs that we know we'll have to incur anyway done now at current prices and values, and build it up over time that way.
We did six sites, and every site we went to, everyone said, everyone said there's never, these numbers are scary anytime you build, and the likelihood that they go down is very low, and so you just got to make sure you have a plan on how you're going to address it. That was a consistent feedback we had, and a lot of the operators, you could live with a plant. You're actually extending the life of the plant and the pumps. If you even, if you end up operating at 50% for longer than you thought, you're actually still not, you're capitalizing on, you're extending the life of some of that equipment that may be replaced sooner. So I would say from an operator's perspective, there's probably more concerned operators that you're under designing the plant. But there's a balance there. There's certainly a balance, and that's where we think that 2-3, 3-5 is really the decision that we should be making. It does balance that, and we're probably in a more stressed, our variability between the buffers is probably more right now than 5 years ago that some people had to decide, but that's just what we got. That's our timing. We can't, we could revisit what we want to do. That is an option, but I still think I still think we want to get to the point where we think this is the right approach and potentially even bid it before we really decide to pull the plug, because we've made, all these investments can be reignited later. And just the understanding we have is going to help us when development comes. And even in Southeast, if we can lay that plan out, it really helps us get the land that will benefit the whole system. And that's really the goal that we're working towards. So every investment we made today has not been wasted. And that needs to be crystal clear to the community. Everything we're doing has not been wasted. If prices spike 20% and we have to pause it at a bid, we have to make that decision in the future. But I still think we're spending valuable money right now to help us understand our options.
Agreed.
Yeah.
I'll say one last piece is, we were at a conference just last week, and talking to a few communities about similar issues where, hey, when you built your initial plant, did it have excess capacity, or was it what you needed? And a lot of times it had excess capacity. And these supervisors, superintendents didn't complain about having it. If it takes longer to use the capacity you built, it's appreciated on the operational side. So yes, it's an investment, but the risk is a little bit less. You will eventually, as long as you eventually use the capacity, there's no loss if it takes you longer to get to the point where you absolutely need it. Running a plant slower, just like working your heart less hard, it helps it last longer. So that's not all bad.
Working your heart less does not make it last longer. Just FYI.
We understood the analogy.
That's exercise.
Well, thank you for having us, we appreciate it.
Thank you
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Appreciate it. All right, I'll go ahead and make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.